Welcome, good afternoon, and welcome to the New School and to the Tishman Auditorium. Each of these are places where New Yorkers have come to discuss the controversial and significant subjects of their time. Today, we celebrate the founding of the first peer learning program here at New School 50 years ago. It has always been appropriate to me that a program designed to encourage lifelong learning throughout the life cycle should have been developed here at the New School, which for almost a century has been committed to educating educated adults like yourselves. I'm Michael Markowitz, director of the program, and I would like to point out to you that in the brochure you received, you'll find a program for today which lists the program and the notes about the composer. I would like to thank for their support Executive Dean David Scobie, who will speak later, and many other people at the New School. Editors of the Anniversary Journal deserve special commendation. They have put forward such a positive image of us, and I want to thank them individually: John Cooney, Leslie Davis, Sarah Odie, and Walter Wegline. I also want to thank the staff of the New School Communication and External Affairs Department, who helped us with our message and helped us to spread the word and helped us to issue a much better publication than it would have been without their help. I do want to thank especially Miriam Lawrence, Annette Fiedler, Amy Brenner, and Pam Tillis, the special events coordinator of the New School. Each of them anticipated steps with insight and humor and helped move forward a very complex plan. In your program for today, you will find a listing of Voices Online, the online address of our new literary publication. For this, I want to thank Tom Ashley, who served as publisher, Ron Russo, Charles Trube, Eileen Brenner, Lorna Porter, and Sarah White, who worked as editors and as staff on creating a wonderful online literary magazine. Special commendation must be given to Kay Oppenheimer, who was our one-person catering department, as you will see. And now I'm going to ask Norma Grossman to read from a mayoral proclamation. Norma has spent almost 20 years at the New School after a career as a teacher. She helped us through difficult times, and she operated in a number of different capacities. She herself has developed study groups on growing up Asian American, to cellular biology, immigration, human origins, perspectives on lying, and voices of exiles. I want you to turn the floor over to Norma, who will read to us, if I find it, here it is, read to us from the mayoral proclamation. Norma.
Thank you, sir. Have a copy over here?
Yeah.
It's underneath. Okay, hi. I want to thank Michael. I want to thank the IRP for a great opportunity. I really appreciate the time that I've had here and the opportunities that I've had. Okay, this is Now, the copy that I gave you became of it. Okay, I'll read it from here. Okay, this is the mayor's proclamation. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, whereas learning new things isn't always easy. People get set in their ways after all, and we become reluctant to leave our comfort zones. For anyone who hasn't sat in a classroom in a while, going back to school can be especially intimidating. Fortunately, New York City is the home of one institution in particular that has demonstrated both the power of education and the fact that ceaseless learning is life's greatest adventure. That is why we are happy to join the New School Institute for Retired Professionals in celebrating its 50th anniversary. Whereas the IRP was founded by a group of retired teachers who sought to continue the studies that had made their careers so fulfilling. The country's first peer learning program for retirees, the IRP has become a center of the city's intellectual life, welcoming students and community guests to free public programs, including its Film Quest and Fridays at One series. And from ancient history to current events, its study groups also have been something for everyone looking to participate in the critical discussions that can make our retirement years even more intellectually stimulating than the times we first encountered Plutarch's Lives, Shakespeare's verse, or, of course, the classic Bloomberg by Bloomberg. Whereas continuing education courses have been central to the New School's mission since its establishment nearly a century ago, the IRP has carried on this tradition, making adult learning more accessible and more inclusive, and it has inspired more than 400 university-based programs that follow the IRP model. Together with the IRP's director, Michael Markowitz, its students, and the entire New School community, we celebrate this milestone in the life of the IRP, and we look forward to even more independent learners pursuing their interest here in the years ahead. Now, therefore, I, Michael R. Bloomberg, Mayor of the City of New York, in recognition of this 50th anniversary celebration, do hereby proclaim Saturday, October 13th, 2012, in the City of New York as the New School Institute for Retired Professionals Day.
Guard this with your life, Norma. On your program, the next thing is the fanfare commissioned by the New School IRP through composer David Tcimpidis. Telling you a little bit about the program will be Annette Fiddler.
In September of 1927, Aaron Copland joined the faculty of the New School for Social Research, and his lectures over the next 10 years formed the basis of his still best-selling book, What to Listen For in Music. During that time, Copland also wrote Piano Variations and El Salon, Mexico. How fitting it is then that today, 85 years later, we have the privilege of hearing the premiere performance of a composition also written by a New School faculty member, whose work reflects the cultural richness that has been the hallmark of the New School since its founding. Our composer, who unfortunately is a little delayed because of car trouble, but will arrive, David Tcimpidis, is a member of the composition faculty and coordinator of new music and composition activities at Mannes College, the New School for Music. A Ford Foundation Fellow, he has also been the director since 1999 of the widely respected composition program at California Summer Music in Sonoma, and a founding member of the New School-based composers group, Music Under Construction. The piece, a fanfare called We Would Be Building, was commissioned by the IRP in celebration of its 50th anniversary and is an example of the unique and nurturing relationship between the IRP and the divisions of the new school. On the reverse side of your program, you'll find David's artist statement, or notes from the composer, which I hope you'll read in its entirety, and from which I will quote just briefly. Some decades ago, I came across a poem, We Would Be Building, clearly intended as a text for a hymn, written in the early 20th century by a little-known figure named Perd Dietz. The text haunted me, and I eventually wrote a hymn to which it could be sung. It was sung once and then shelved. When I accepted the commission from the IRP, the poem awakened from its decades-long slumber and materialized before me. The poem, We Would Be Building Temples Still Undone, must surely describe the attitudes and proud achievements of the IRP over the past 50 years. I can only hope that now, in its new guise, my hymn tune will find new life and live on to inspire people everywhere to continue their work and to continue building. Ladies and gentlemen, David Tcimpidis, We Will Be Building.
The composer, David Tcimpidis. Thank you. How wonderful to be part of a university where their students along with us, and how much we can learn from each other. And this kind of crossing and cross-fertilization is so important, and it happens more at the New School than at most places I've been. Again, thank you, David. We hope to see you back when we close the program in April. Now, Linda Luskin will read from a note we received from Sandra Farganis, the former director of the Vera List Center.
Hi. I wish I could be with you today to celebrate this wonderful occasion, but as I cannot, I'd like to share a few words with you. I want to congratulate the IRP for being at the forefront of adult peer learning, for assisting the New School in being progressive, informed, and engaged, and for staying the course for 50 years and counting. I have had the good fortune of working with the IRP in the many lives I have had at the New School when I arrived here in 1988. I never failed to marvel over the commitments of the members to both the IRP and the university in general. And of course, you were into public engagement earlier than most. I had the good fortune of spending most of my administrative life on the 5th floor, and I could always count on one of your members collaring, or is it cornering, me, to put me on the intellectual spot respecting some political issue that he or she had become obsessed with. Any getting away from IRP conversations when buttonholed was not easy, but it was always rewarding. For me, the frosting on the cake was actually teaching a class with credit, non-credit, and IRP students. Nothing had prepared me for the toughness of the task at hand and the exhilaration if the job was done correctly. I had taught classes on gender. I had written books on gender, but taking material I used with undergraduates at Vassar into a 12th Street classroom where I had students who had come to political consciousness when most of the class was yet to be born was among the most fantastic experiences I have had in the academy. I adored teaching IRP students, and I can never say thank you enough for being there and letting me be a part of you. So enjoy this day and this year. I miss you. And please, where are you, Michael? Where'd he go? Oh, give Michael a big hug from me, and when he sees me, he'll give me the hug back.
Well, that made all the worrying worthwhile. The next speaker, it will be David Scobie, who is the Executive Dean of the New School for Public Engagement. That is our parent division. David received his PhD from Yale and is a former professor of architecture at the University of Michigan. He has proven to be a strong, strong supporter of the IRP and is committed to that which we do here. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. And actually, before I begin with praise and celebration of the IRP and you all, let me start with some warm thanks and appreciation for Michael Markowitz. He and I meet regularly every month, planning, thinking, looking forward to the future of the IRP. And I know from working with him how important and effective and committed his leadership is. The IRP is flourishing. It's because of you, but also especially because of him. Let's give him thanks. Michael said just before we started that it's a glorious day today, and it is. It's a historic day. I want to salute the Institute for Retired Professionals for its longevity, for 50 years of sustained activity and success, but I'd say even more especially for its creativity and educational quality, for your creativity and educational quality. All of you who are members, and especially the veterans, know how great the IRP study groups and the other programs are. You know better than I do that the Institute has long been a national model for retiree education, copied and emulated all around the country. And you know far, far better than I do how important such lifelong learning is to the learners who take part in it. You've helped to start a movement, and every retiree educational program owes something to the IRP's history that we're celebrating today. But as I say, you don't need me to tell you that. You don't need me to assure you of the value and vibrancy of the lifelong learning that the IRP fosters. What I do want to say, and maybe what it's my role to say today, is how much you embody and exemplify the values, the core values of the New School, and especially our division, the New School for Public Engagement, the direct descendant of the adult division within which the IRP was founded a half century ago. And so it's a special honor, I think, for us to have the Institute within the New School for Public Engagement, and I'm personally honored to be helping to steward it. I want to celebrate 3 ways in which the IRP has modeled the kind of university, or maybe it's better to say the kind of anti-university, the New School aspires to be. First of all, you exemplify the ideal of a university as a learning community. I know from talking with many of you and from reading this wonderful booklet, if you have not had a chance to pore over it, when you get home, make sure you read it cover to cover. It has amazing stories and interviews and history in it. But from all of that, I know how the personal importance of the sociability that the IRP provides, what the booklet calls the community beyond the classroom. This emphasis on community isn't just a matter of personal and social pleasure and belonging, although that's crucially important. It's also a core principle of teaching and learning. Education always takes place in the first person plural, for the IRP and for the whole new school. The culture of belonging that you create is an important model and an important value for us. Secondly, the amazing range of the study groups that you lead exemplifies the ideal of robust curiosity and engagement in the world. I loved Sandra's phrase of progressive, informed, and engaged. That captures it wonderfully. Since the university's founding in 1919, it's been part of the DNA of the new school to be progressive, informed, and engaged, to engage education about the largest issues and ideas and controversies of the past and of the present. You renewed that mission of engaged learning in 1962 when the IRP was founded, and 2 years ago when General Studies and Milano merged under the name of the New School of Public Engagement, we rededicated ourselves to the pleasures and importance of the kind of engaged study that the IRP has exemplified. And finally, and maybe for me most importantly, the IRP exemplifies a commitment to an innovative and democratic model of teaching and learning, the radical experiment of trusting peers to teach and learn together. That same trust in learners to collaboratively design their own education, to meld the role of teacher and student, seems to me an inspiration for the university's own traditions of radical educational practice and innovative teaching. These values have stood the IRP well through many, many changes. Think about what's happened since the IRP's founding in 1962. In 1962, of course, the internet didn't exist, and neither did the discipline of neuroscience or the High Line. The World Trade Center hadn't yet been built, nor, of course, had it yet been attacked and destroyed. Barack Obama was 1 year old, and it would have been unthinkable for a mixed-race person to become president. Closer to home, the New School for Public Engagement didn't exist, but neither did the New School for General Studies, nor did Eugene Lang College. Parsons did exist as a design school, but it wasn't part of the New School. In fact, it wouldn't join the New School for nearly another 20 years. In other words, you've sustained this commitment to community, to engaged learning, and to innovative learning and teaching through 50 years of dramatic change in the world and in this place. You've been an anchor and a through line for the New School through all those years. So now let's look forward to the next 50 years, to the centenary anniversary of the IRP, when our children and grandchildren will be members. What on earth will the IRP or the New School or American higher education, for that matter, look like? We know that things will be radically different in many ways. I'm betting that we will long have had a female president, and a Jewish president, and a Muslim president. I hope that the New School for Public Engagement has not been given another name, and IRP members will almost certainly be masters of a whole bunch of new digital technologies that probably flummox most of us today. They'll be meeting in online virtual study groups, and in fact, I'd bet that IRP study groups may convene through some kind of newfangled teleconferencing from all around the world. At the same time, I also suspect that the IRP model of peer education, of students coming together to shape their own learning for their own curiosity and needs, will be even more of a model across higher education. In fact, I'm convinced that this model of networked peer-led study groups will be going strong, more convinced than I am that traditional universities will survive. In that sense, the IRP may well be the key pioneer and not just a survivor on its 100th anniversary. Whatever shape the IRP takes, it's important to honor the past and present achievement of the Institute. Michael and the board and study group leaders and all of you members have created and sustained a vibrant and I'd even say radical educational community, one that inspires us as we build our own division and renew our university. So that's why I decided this week, true story, that I wanted to join the IRP. Not because I'm ready to become a retired professional, but because I'm ready to learn from the Institute and to be part of the conversations about its future. I asked Michael if it would be appropriate to join, and he informed me that the Institute had a non-discrimination policy. Even a working dean can join. But he did warn me that all prospective members had to go through a rigorous entrance exam with 3 members of the IRP. So I want to leave you with 2 entreaties. First of all, join me in celebrating the first 50 years of the Institute and its success and vibrancy. And secondly, please take it easy on the interview.
Thank you, David. Thank you from all of us. After the guest speaker speaks, we're going to go into the garden to have a celebratory toast. But that will be done after the guest speaker speaks and answers questions. At this point, Dick Kossoff, who is a student in the IRP and chairman of the IRP Advisory Board, will introduce Robert Dallek.
Today I have the honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Bob Dallek, considered by many as the #1 presidential historian in America. To have Professor Dallek here just 3 weeks before the election to provide his insights and analysis of the presidency is an amazing way to start the 50th. Now, somebody could say, how do you know he's the best? Well, let me give you an experience I had just before the election 4 years ago. I turned on Channel 2, and there was Bob Dallek being interviewed. I had missed part of it. I heard it, and after he was off, I went inside, and about 2 hours later, I turned on the TV again, different channel. There was Bob Dallek, and I said, maybe it's a rerun. No, different suit, different interviewer, and different place. But that wasn't the end. Another 3 hours later on Channel 7, I turned it on again, and guess who was there? It was Bob Dallek being interviewed again by a different person. So on the 3 major channels, Bob Dallek was the one they picked to give his take. At that point, I knew that he was the best. There are several ways I could introduce Bob Dallek, who is an extraordinary teacher, a best-selling author and historian. But the way I have chosen is simply to start from the beginning. Bob Dallek grew up in Brooklyn, and he attended James Madison High School, which, by the way, is the home of many people in the IRP. He matriculated at the University of Illinois, and no, he did not matriculate as a history major. He matriculated as a dentist. Fortunately for America, he quickly realized that history was his passion, and he made the switch. He then obtained his doctorate from Columbia and taught there, and this was followed by a long history of professorships at UCLA, Oxford, Dartmouth, Boston University, and too many institutions to tell you about. It was then that he began authoring a shelf of important books on the presidency, which has now continued for an amazing 30 years. The common denominator in his books, which I think separates him from the crowd of other presidential historians, is his talent for capturing the nuances, the real working of the presidency, and the collective impact on how the presidency really runs. These skills were very quickly appreciated by his colleagues and the American public, as he won the coveted Bancroft Prize in History for his book on Franklin D. Roosevelt and American foreign policy. He continued to write well-received books, many of you may have read them, on Harry Truman, on Lyndon Johnson, on Ronald Reagan, and many others. Also, his book on Nixon and Kissinger, Partners in Power, was a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize. But many feel it was his unfinished life, the biography of John F. Kennedy, written with the cooperation of the Kennedy family, that really made his name. It put him on the front page of the Times and on the bestseller list. And you can be well assured, when the Kennedy family went out looking for someone to write this book, there was a line around the block of journalists, historians, and academics, and in the end, they picked Bob Dallek. But you don't have to go very far to get rave reviews about Professor Dallek. Just ask two IRP members, Walter Wagline and Michael Shapiro, who teach a course here on the Kennedys. In a recent email to me, they said, "We are studying it line by line with respect and admiration." There's one other activity I'd like to mention, which you won't find on his vitae, and that is his invitation to the White House for the last 3 years by the president to sit with an eminent group of historians and dialogue about major issues. For a presidential historian, it doesn't get better than that. So now, please join me in welcoming for our 50th anniversary keynote speaker, Professor Bob Dallek, whose topic will be the making and unmaking of American presidents. Professor Dallek.
Thank you, Dick. It's an honor to be here on this special occasion. I'm flattered to have been invited to give this keynote speech, and I should say a few things before I begin speaking about my topic of the day. One is that I never gave President Obama any advice on how to debate. In fact, none of us said a word to him about how to debate. And so, but if we get to see him again, we'll have a few things to tell him. Dick, I should also tell you that I appreciate that wonderful introduction. And I like it a lot more than one I got a number of years back when I was lecturing in the Soviet Union. My host on that occasion, who I like to think had an imperfect command of English, introduced me by saying, Professor Dallek is the author of several distinguished works. They're the kinds of books that once you put them down, you can't pick them up again. I didn't know what to say. I also like to begin these talks by saying a word about historical methodology. You know, historians like to try and be scientific, say, well, you know, we've got something approaching a science. And when I hear that, I always think back to an episode when my son, who also is a historian, when he was about 4 years old, he said to me one day, Daddy, he said, "You're a doctor, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah, but not like your doctor, not like your pediatrician." And he said, "Oh, I know that because you're also an historian." Well, I was delighted that he could make this distinction at so young an age. But then he wanted to know, does that mean that you make people in the past feel better? That, I guess, would be known as a methodological breakthrough. So let me get to the topic of the day, the making and unmaking of American presidents. And you know, what's so striking is the fact that we've had 44 presidents. And in fact, only 16 of them, only 16, were elected to a second term out of the 44, roughly 1/3. And of those 16, only 13 served 8 years or more. The more, of course, was Franklin Roosevelt, who served more than 12 years. 3 of them never made it through the second term. Lincoln and McKinley were assassinated, and Richard Nixon was forced to resign. See? And the puzzle the historian comes to when you think about the office of the presidency is, why has it been so difficult for these presidents to be reelected, to gain more than a first term, or one term, you see? And I think, to begin with, it has a lot to do with the fact that people in America are not very keen on politicians in politics. They really don't like politics very much. And there's the wonderful story about the 3 professionals who enter into a debate: the physician, the engineer, and the politician. Whose profession is the most important? And the physician said, my profession. We were there at creation. Eve was created by the extraordinary surgery that was performed on Adam's rib. No, the engineer said, you got to take one step back. The Lord created the universe from chaos. It was the greatest engineering feat in history. We engineers were at creation. The politician laughed. He said, take another step back. Who do you think created the chaos? So, people have not been particularly keen on politics and politicians. And you know, generally, they've been very nasty and dismissive of presidents. You go back through our history, and you see the kinds of things that have been said about these men. See, when Jefferson ran in 1800, they said that if he gains the White House, he's the Antichrist. Blood will flow in the streets. The guillotines will go up in the town squares. Remember, this is the time of the French Revolution. They said of Adams, his opponent, that he was a hermaphrodite, half man, half woman, see, to demean him. The press in those days was very much a partisan press that would attack the opposing presidential candidate. Andrew Jackson, they said he was a bigamist. They didn't leave his wife alone. They attacked her as a slut. That's a quote that was used in one of the newspapers. Poor Abraham Lincoln. They called him the original gorilla. He was a ghoul, a demented fool. They said of him, he's a two-faced liar. And Lincoln could only respond by saying, do you think if I had a second face, I would stay with this one? They attacked Ulysses S. Grant. They said of Grant that the progress of the presidency from George Washington to U.S. Grant is evidence enough to disprove Darwin's theory of evolution. Grant was a Neanderthal. He should have been extinct for ages. Cleveland had an illegitimate child. He was attacked as a moral leper. See, William Jennings Bryan, they described him as a demented radical. Franklin Roosevelt, they called him a demented cripple, you see. The ugly things that they've said about these presidents have been really so terrible and so unpleasant. Now, they've responded in feeling abused, attacked. George Washington said that he had been subjected to so many unmerited censures of the vilest kind, and he couldn't wait to leave the presidency. Jefferson was the same. He called the office a splendid misery and couldn't wait to be done with his term of service. James A. Garfield, in the late 19th century, he said, "What is there about this office that anyone would want to ever get into it in the first place?" See? William Howard Taft said, "It's an impossible position. People think a president can make the grass to grow, the sky to rain, business to be good." He said, "It's nonsense," you see. Now, those were in the days before presidents had so much more power. But even now, you see, these accusations that are leveled against the president, like President Obama, about he's not a miracle worker. These guys can't turn the economy on a dime. But this is part of the rhetoric and the posturing that you always get in these campaigns. Woodrow Wilson said, "No man of ordinary physique can serve in the office if the burdens of it aren't somehow relieved." And of course, Wilson was a victim of that in a sense because he suffered a terrible massive stroke in September 1919 and was immobilized for the rest of his term. Herbert Hoover said the office was a compound hell. Harry Truman described it as like riding on the back of a tiger. And he called the White House the Great White Prison. See? So, why all these attacks? What is there about this institution and about these presidents that invites such unmerited censures of the vilest kind, as Washington said? I see two things at work here. One is the fact that they work. They work. Why are hundreds of millions of dollars being spent this year on attack ads, you see? Now, I doubt that you're seeing much of this in New York. I live in Washington, D.C. We get the spillover from Virginia, so we see some of the attack ads. But if you want to see the kind of ugly things that are going back and forth on the television about these presidents, you need to go to Florida or to Ohio, you see, or to Wisconsin, Michigan, New Hampshire. These are what they call the swing states, the states that are up for grabs. And that's where millions and millions of dollars are being spent. And they have an impact. It helps to shape people's views of what these people are about. Because people don't like politics and they don't pay a hell of a lot of attention to it. And so when they see these ads on television, it seems to influence them. A second reason why I think you see so many of these attack ads is because politicians and people running for the office of the presidency, in general, they don't want to be very specific about what they're going to do if they gain control of the White House, if they reach the Oval Office. And in many ways, with good reason. Woodrow Wilson, for example, in 1916, he ran for re-election on a platform of he kept us out of war. Within a month after he was re-inaugurated, the United States was in World War I. Herbert Hoover, in 1928, promised a chicken in every pot, a car in every garage. Within a year, the country was in the worst economic crisis in its history. In 1940, Franklin Roosevelt, under repeated attack about his willingness to take the United States into the Second World War, he kept saying, this country will not go to war unless attacked by a foreign power. However, the polls were showing that the election was getting much closer, and at his last talk, his last speech on October 31 in Boston, he dropped unless we were attacked by a foreign power, and he made a blanket commitment, this country will not go to war. 13 months later, we were in World War II. And it generated a series of books led by one by a man named Charles Tansel called Backdoor to War, saying Roosevelt lied us into war, which he didn't, of course. But they're very reluctant to make promises. Lyndon Johnson promised, remember, in 1964, American boys should not do the fighting that Asian boys should do. 13 months later, he sent 100,000 American ground troops to fight in Vietnam. So they're reluctant to say what they'll do. The most honest expression I've ever seen from a president-elect, about the uncertainties of what they'll do in office came from John Kennedy. After Kennedy was elected, Robert Kennedy, his brother, said to Arthur Schlesinger, "Arthur, how would you like to be an ambassador?" And Schlesinger said, "No, Bobby, if I do anything, I'd like to go to the White House." So a couple of days later, Schlesinger saw the president-elect, and Kennedy said to him, "So, Arthur, I hear you're coming to the White House." And Schlesinger said, "I am. What will I be doing there?" And Kennedy said, "I don't know, Arthur. I don't even know what I'll be doing there, but you can bet we'll both be busy more than 8 hours a day." It really was a kind of honest statement of the uncertainty that they face when they get to the office. So, my task today is to say, in light of the fact that there's been so much hostility to them, in light of the fact that it is so difficult to be elected to a second term, that the office, as Jefferson said, is a splendid misery. How do we account for the fact that there have been some great presidents, that there have been Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman? There have been some extraordinary leaders in the White House in our time and through our history. Let me point to a number of things which I think explain, or at least go far to explain, how it is that presidents have been effective. First of all, I would say it helps a great deal to be lucky. Napoleon once said, "Give me generals who know something about tactics and strategy, but best of all, give me generals who are lucky." See, two of the unluckiest presidents in American history were Herbert Hoover. Hoover was a very decent man. He was a progressive Republican, a usually successful businessman, which may tell us something about electing a businessman to the presidency. That is one piece of advice I sent to the White House. The other one who was incredibly unlucky, I think, was Jimmy Carter. See, the hostage crisis that he faced, the oil crunch, see. So if you're lucky, it can be really constructive and helpful to you. But I don't think that by any means explains how and why presidents have been effective or successful. Because consider the following. Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft faced very similar circumstances. TR remembered as a great president, Taft as largely a failed leader. See? Herbert Hoover, Franklin Roosevelt faced very similar circumstances. The misery of the Great Depression. Hoover, one of the great failures of American presidential history, and Roosevelt considered almost universally as one of the three greatest presidents in American history. Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, Carter seen as a great ex-president, but as someone who did not do well in the White House. And Reagan is celebrated certainly by his party as a very effective presidential leader. So there's much more going on here than simply luck. And let me point to what I think has been at work. First of all, I would say every great president has been a great visionary. They had a vision, an idea of where they wanted to lead the country in the long run. And not only did they have an idea of where they wanted to lead the country, but they had a way of communicating it to people in some pithy phrase, in some concise, almost bumper sticker fashion that made clear to people what this administration was about. Theodore Roosevelt had something called the Square Deal, and FDR called it the New Deal. Harry Truman, the Fair Deal. John Kennedy, the New Frontier. Lyndon Johnson, the Great Society, you see. Reagan called his program the Reagan Revolution. So they communicate to people this grand design, this vision. Let me give you 2 examples of how I think this vision worked to really give 2 presidents at least a substantial hold on, enduring hold on their historical reputation. One is Lyndon Johnson. Now, LBJ, of course, forever will bear the burden of that Vietnam War. It's blighted his presidential reputation. But there's the domestic side to Johnson's leadership. And above all, on civil rights, he was the most extraordinary visionary the country has had on that kind of issue. Consider the following. Johnson understood that segregation in the South not only divided the races, but it segregated the South from the rest of the country. In many ways, in the early years of the 20th century, lots of people thought of the South as the crazy ant hid in the attic, and especially in the Cold War, when the Soviet Union and China attacked the United States relentlessly about its racism, you see. What Johnson understood was that if he could bring about integration of the races in the South, it would not only integrate the races, but it would integrate the South into the rest of the nation. And it was a brilliant vision in the sense that up to Lyndon Johnson, a Southerner could not run for president of the United States. The Civil War still cast such a long shadow over presidential nominations. And since Johnson, look what's happened. We've had not only Johnson, we've had Jimmy Carter, we've had Bill Clinton, we've had the 2 Bushes from Texas. You see, being from the South is no longer that liability. But Johnson understood the irony of him pushing through this civil rights bill. When it passed, Bill Moyers, his press secretary, found him in bed the next morning reading the headlines in the newspapers, and he seemed demoralized, glum. And Moyers said to him, "Mr. President, why are you so glum? This is a great day in your administration." And Johnson said to him, "Bill, I think we've just given away the South to the Republican Party for as far into the future as we can see." And again, he was absolutely right about the politics, you see. Another great visionary who continues to have a hold on the public's imagination is Woodrow Wilson. Now, Wilson promised in World War I a war to end all wars, a war to make the world safe for democracy. Now, on the face of it, of course, a war to end all wars? What idealism, what hope. But you know, it gives him an enduring hold on the public because Americans are idealistic and they find it a vision which resonates with them to this day. And so even though Wilson wasn't able to achieve that, he was, I think, seen and remains in the public's mind as a truly great visionary. So I would say, first of all, to be a great president, you need to be a great visionary. Secondly, I think there needs to be the power of presidential personality, especially in this media age, you see. The greatest presidents have been those who can connect with the public through the power of their personality. Theodore Roosevelt, people loved TR. He was the first one to hold press conferences. He used his family to generate a positive image about himself, see. They named a teddy bear after him, see. Woodrow Wilson, it was said, gave speeches that were so lyrical you could have danced to them. The master of all this was Franklin Roosevelt, FDR. I'm sure some of you in this audience have listened to his fireside chats, see. He came to the White House. He understood the extraordinary power of radio and how he could use it to create a connection to a mass audience. The first speech he gave, fireside chat, was about the banking crisis. The banks were collapsing, they were closing. Roosevelt gets on the radio, and he creates the image of himself sitting next to a fireside in your living room. He's paterfamilias. He's your uncle, your relative. He cares about you. And he talks not about a malaise. He says what? We're going to have a bank holiday. He understood the use of language. See, we'll have a bank holiday. People went out. 3 days, 4 days later, when they reopened the banks, people rushed to put money back in the banks. Walter Lippmann, the great columnist, said, nothing's changed in the economy, but the mood of the country had shifted overnight, see. And Roosevelt's predecessor, Herbert Hoover, they said of him, a rose would wilt in his hand. He was so morose. He himself said, if only there were a song, a joke, a story that could be told that could lift people's spirits. But Roosevelt did it, you see. And I love the anecdote that after he died, somebody stopped Mrs. Roosevelt on the street and said to her, Mrs. Roosevelt, I miss the way your husband used to speak to me about my government. Can you imagine anyone saying that about a politician now, you see? Or the man, as Roosevelt died in Warm Springs, Georgia, the body was being transported back to Hyde Park for burial, and a man stood by the railway tracks sobbing, and somebody next to him said, did you know the president? He said, no, but he knew me. So revealing of the way in which he was able to connect. Harry Truman. 1948, I'm sure some of you remember this. There wasn't a chance in the world he was going to beat Tom Dewey. Everybody, except for Harry Truman, was convinced he would lose. Truman does this whistle-stop tour, gets out on the back of that train. He'd pull into some small town 11 o'clock at night. He'd come out on the back of the train in his bathrobe and pajamas, and he'd give a pep talk to the people. And they began shouting to him, give him hell, Harry, give him hell, see. And by contrast, his opponent, Tom Dewey, the governor of New York, Dewey thought he had the election in the bag, didn't have to bother. But they said of Dewey that he was the only man who could strut sitting down. He looked like the bridegroom on the wedding cake. And he lacked that kind of connection, that ability to connect, you see. John Kennedy. Next year, it'll be the 50th anniversary of his assassination, see. And if you go to the Kennedy Library and walk in there and look up at the poster of him looking down on you, he's frozen in our minds at the age of 46, see. Nobody can believe now he would have been in his 90s, see. But he was the first one to give live televised press conferences. He was told by some of his aides, don't do it, it's risky. But he knew that television was his ally, especially after he debated Richard Nixon. People who listened to that debate on the radio thought Nixon had won. And almost everyone who watched it on television thought Kennedy had won. Nixon had been sick, had been hospitalized. Somebody said he looked like a sinister chipmunk. And Mayor Daley of Chicago said he looked like they had embalmed him before he died. He wore the wrong color suit. His pancake makeup ran. He had 5 o'clock shadow. And Kennedy, and I was so struck by this the other night in the debate Biden had with Ryan. I'm sure you noted, Biden would stop and he'd look out at the audience and look into the camera and say, folks, see, he learned this from Kennedy. Because Kennedy, when he debated Nixon, Nixon wanted to debate him. Nixon was a good debater. And Kennedy didn't give him much chance in the sense that he talked to the audience and to the country, see. And it created a kind of connection, see. There was a poll about 16 months ago asking Americans to assess the last 9 presidents from John Kennedy to George W. Bush. Guess who came in number 1? John Kennedy. Not only did he come in number 1, he had an 85% approval rating. The only one within hailing distance of him was Ronald Reagan with 74%. And the question is, why? What is there about Kennedy. The 7th shortest presidency in American history, 1,000 days, you see. You see, the country, I think, has been so demoralized by his assassination. I don't think the country's gotten over that yet, you see. Demoralized by the failure of the Vietnam War, by Watergate, Koreagate, by the Iraq War, where the feeling was that the country was deceived about weapons of mass destruction. And what the country wants is to have a president they can continue to have a kind of faith in, a belief in, that gives them hope, see. Kennedy with the new frontier, promising to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade, see. Reagan similarly. Reagan said, "Morning in America, the pride is back." And so Americans, I think, are drawn to these two former presidents in a way that none of the other presidents resonate with the public, you see. And so the power of presidential personality. By contrast, our friend LBJ, Johnson, the anecdote goes, said to Dean Acheson, Harry Truman's Secretary of State, "Dean, why don't people like me?" And Acheson's supposed to have said, "Because, Lyndon, Mr. President, you're not a very likable guy." See? It's probably apocryphal, but it resonates. The cartoons, see, humor is so revealing of politics in this country. As Freud said, it's a form of hostility, you see, which is socialized. The cartoon of Johnson showing off, David Levine cartoon, showing off the scar of his surgery in the form of the Vietnam War, or the pictures of him picking up the beagle by the ears, you see. Or the anecdote they would tell that Johnson was so overbearing and had to be number one. When he was Senate Majority Leader, he got the first car telephone of any senator in Washington, his limo. Everett Dirksen, his Republican rival, went out and got one, called Johnson up and said, "Lyndon, I want to be your first one I called on my new car telephone." And Johnson said, "Can you hang on a second, Ev? My other phone is ringing." But he did not come across as someone who was generated much affection. The press, dealing with the press. Franklin Roosevelt used to call in the reporters, and he'd sit at his desk. Of course, as we know, he was paralyzed. He couldn't walk, see. But he'd say at the end of the talk, well, boys, I got to run, see. And there is not a single surviving photograph of Roosevelt during his presidency demonstrating his problem, his paralysis. The only time in his entire presidential career he ever made reference to his disability was when he came back from the Yalta Conference in February 1945. He gave a speech before a joint session of Congress, and he said, "I know you will forgive me for sitting down. I've just returned from a journey of 10,000 miles, and I carry 10 pounds of steel around each of my lower limbs." It's the only reference he ever made to his disability. If you go and visit the FDR Memorial in Washington, D.C., you will see when you first get into the memorial that there is a statue of Roosevelt in a wheelchair. Now, that wasn't there in the beginning. It was only put in as an afterthought because there was a lot of controversy about it, because Roosevelt wanted to hide this. But, you know, this is historical reality, just as they didn't want to have some statues or photos of him with the up-tilted head smoking a cigarette, see. But this is historical reality, and you shouldn't blink it, one might say. So, vision, charisma, or power of presidential personality. Third thing I'd point to is pragmatism. The greatest, most effective presidents have been great pragmatists. In 1932, when Roosevelt ran for the office, Herbert Hoover called him a chameleon on plaid, see, if you get the image. He gave 2 speeches during that campaign about the protective tariff, which was quite controversial. He had a high tariff and a low tariff speech. This is in the days before television and the internet. He'd get to a high tariff area, they'd give the high tariff speech. Low tariff area, they'd give the low tariff. They finally got to an area that was mixed, and they said, what will we do? He gave the speech. At the end of the speech, people in the crowd for high tariff thought he was for high tariff. People in the crowd for low tariff thought he was for low tariff. And that's the definition of a goddamn good politician. And he was that. He compared his New Deal to a series of experiments. He said he was like the quarterback on the football team. He would try one play. If it didn't work, he would move on to something else. His protege was Lyndon Johnson. And Johnson was also a phenomenal pragmatist, brilliant manipulator of the Congress. And if you can ever listen to some of the taped conversations he has with senators and congressmen, it shows you the way in which he would deal with them. But he used to love to tell the anecdote about himself. And when he was Senate Majority Leader, Richard Nixon went to Latin America and was spat upon, stoned, almost killed in Caracas, Venezuela, came back to a hero's welcome at Andrews Air Force Base. Johnson was out there to greet him along with the other dignitaries. A couple of days later, a reporter caught up with Johnson on Capitol Hill and said, Senator, I thought you told me last week that this guy Nixon was nothing but chicken shit. And Johnson said, son, what you got to understand is in politics, chicken shit overnight can turn to chicken salad. There are stories of him sitting with Everett Dirksen, his rival, sitting kneecap to kneecap at the White House, drinking bourbon and branch water. And Dirksen would say, Mr. President, I have a fine young man in my state of Illinois who deserves a judgeship. And Johnson would say, Ev, we're going to look into that. The deal was struck. Dirksen was going to vote for Johnson's latest piece of legislation, and Dirksen was going to get the judgeship for his guy. Now, in this day of constant media attention, the 24/7 news cycle, you see, it's much more difficult to do that. Because on this issue of pragmatism, politicians, if you look like an opportunist, see, it's very destructive. But if you come across as pragmatic in the service of some larger constructive design, it's quite all right, you see. So pragmatism is essential in a society like ours that is so divided by so many issues. Next, I would say, is the issue of trust, credibility. If a president loses credibility, they can't govern anymore. And they lose it in two ways. They've lost it in the past in two ways. Overreaching. Woodrow Wilson promising a war to end all wars, he couldn't do it. He could not command public support for his treaty and his league at the end of his term, see. Johnson, a war on poverty, he promised too much. He changed the face of this country in many ways. They reduced poverty from some 23% to about 13%. But he couldn't abolish it, you see, and he overpromised. Lying. The day Richard Nixon went before a press conference and said, I am not a crook, is the day his presidency was over. If you have to tell the public I am not a crook, even worse than a president who gets up and says, I did not have sex with that woman. It was so destructive to Bill Clinton's presidency. But, you know, presidential reputation changes, and Bill Clinton is so back on top. If you watched him at that Democratic convention, he commands the stage. The guy is just brilliant at this. I mean, hell, if he were running, he'd win in a landslide this year, I think. So trust. Finally, I would say, the issue of consensus. Consensus. This is such a diverse country. Different regions, religions, races, ethnicities. There's such a struggle over these divides. And now in particular, the country seems so divided, so at sixes and sevens, you see. And indeed, President Obama at one of our dinners said to us, if I'm elected to a second term and I have to deal with the Republican Congress, he said, I'll be doing a lot more in foreign affairs, see, because this is where they have running room, you see. And I should say just a final word about those dinners. He's a very bright man and a very attractive man. And it's like being in a seminar with another academic. And he wanted to talk to us initially about a transformative presidency. How did TR, how did Wilson, how did FDR, how did Reagan achieve this? He wanted to talk about these larger historical moments. The last dinner was a year ago, last July, and frankly, at that point, he was angry at the Congress because people like Michelle Bachmann were giving him a lot of grief. And so I couldn't resist. My wife has told me I could only tell one joke at each of these dinners. So I leaned over, I was sitting next to him, and I said, Mr. President, I guess you know what Mark Twain said about congressmen. He shook his head. Mark Twain said, suppose you were a congressman, and suppose you were an idiot, but I repeat myself. Thank you. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Professor Dallek. Professor Dallek will answer some questions. I ask you not to speak unless you've got one of the mics that these two students are passing around to us. Raise your hands, they'll come over to you, and we'll try to cover as many questions as we can in about 20 minutes.
Still on? Professor Dallek, you in effect ask us to reevaluate Wilson. You praise his idealism, say that's inherent in a successful president.
Yes.
But didn't his insistence on self-determination create the fierce, irrational nationalism that led the way to Hitler, the dismemberment in Czechoslovakia, and World War II?
Well, I would hate to blame Hitler on Woodrow Wilson. I think we can lay that at Germany's doorstep. But self-determination has been a very controversial matter. On the other hand, I think it's one of those things that does have huge appeal to most Americans, because it came into vogue with anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism. And this country, of course, came into existence as a rebel against a colonial power, see. And one of the great acts of American history, I think, was what was known as the Northwest Ordinance of 1794, in which the country committed itself to the idea that every territory that came under our control should have the opportunity to come into the United States as a co-equal state. We were not going to have colonialism. We weren't going to have colonies. So in a sense, everybody should have self-determination. They should have the right to vote, democracy, participation. It has caused problems. There's no question about it. But it's an imperfect world. And as Winston Churchill once said, democracy is the worst possible system except for all the rest, see? And one could say, maybe say that also about self-determination. Wilson was flawed. And of course, he was the one who introduced racial segregation into Washington, D.C. It's hardly something one would celebrate as part of his presidency. But he was a progressive. He did introduce some very important things, like the Federal Reserve, see, the Federal Trade Commission, were part of his reform program, his reform agenda. And there were social welfare actions that he took that resonate to this day. He was drawn into World War I. I have serious questions about whether the United States should have ever gotten into that war. And maybe it would have been better if that war had ended in a deadlock, because it might then have prevented the rise of Nazism in Germany, the rise of fascism in Italy. Now, Counterfactual history is, of course, terribly speculative, but yeah, self-determination is a controversial point, and of course, when you think about it, nation building, the recent efforts we've taken at this, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, one can have huge questions about that. And I would just tell you one anecdote in relation to the Afghanistan business. At the first dinner we had with President Obama, Bob Caro, Johnson's biographer, was there, and he said to the president that Johnson's Great Society was undermined by going into the Vietnam War, obliquely raising the question, because at this time, it was in June of 2009, what was Obama going to do about Afghanistan? Would there be a surge and increase the troops? And I then said to him, Mr. President, I teach a rule in American history that these big wars kill off domestic reform programs. World War I killed off progressivism. Franklin Roosevelt said, Dr. Win the War has been replaced by Dr. New Deal. Dr. New Deal has been replaced by Dr. Win the War. Harry Truman's Fair Deal went a glimmering with Korea, you see, and of course, Vietnam. And now Gary Wills, the great historian, was at that dinner, and he didn't pull any punches. He said to the president, if you go and escalate in Afghanistan, you'll be making a huge mistake. And Obama, it's the only time in all those dinners he said, off the record, he said, I'm not unmindful of what you're telling me, but I've got a problem. He wasn't explicit about that, but I think what he was referring to was the fact that you cannot separate in this country foreign policy from domestic politics, see. And during the 2008 campaign, he said Iraq was a mistake, but Afghanistan was a proper place to have fought. And in a sense, he couldn't back away from that, see. Well, this was part of the vice presidential debate the other night, and I'm sure it's going to come up in the debate, the next two debates between the president and Romney, see. So these ideas of nation building and bringing, democracy to these other countries and giving them self-determination, it's controversial. It's an uncertain business. I'm not an isolationist, but I'm not a believer in these, adventures all over the world. I think they're a real mistake.
Yes, I'd like to make some money, and so I'm asking this question.
Will I share in that?
Who is going to, absolutely, who is going to win the election and why?
He doesn't fool around. He gets right to the point.
He's done.
I think Obama will win. I think, of course, he deserves to win. I think Romney has been a really lousy candidate. He's been a very poor candidate. And what's sad to me, frankly, to be entirely blunt, is the fact that you don't win an election by being on the defensive all the time. And Romney was constantly on the defensive because of his misstatements, because of the confusion and contradictions. And the other thing, at the last dinner we had with President Obama, he said, I'm not worried about any of these Republicans in this election. He said, this fellow Romney has twisted himself into a pretzel. He said, my opponent in this election is the economy, see? And I think it was really quite astute. But I think the power, charisma, the polls show Obama has a decisive lead over Romney in this quotient of appeal, personal appeal. I think he'll do much better in the second debate. At a minimum, people will see it as, a tied contest, see. But he seems to be doing really pretty darn well in the swing states. Now, it's eroded somewhat. But, Obama wasn't going to win Ohio by 8 points. He's not going to win Florida by 8 points. Nobody's going to win one of those states by 8 points. And so you have to be cautious about what these polls show you at the outset. But I think he's in pretty decent shape, and it's, not that long to the election. Something can always happen at the last minute, which can sidetrack things. But my guess is that he will win. And then historians will look back on this and they will talk about what a poor candidate Romney really was. And my guess is that in the next debate, Obama's going to go after him for failing to be, very specific about how you're going to do these tax cuts and how you're going to balance the budget and, how you're going to deal with Afghanistan. And there are a host of things that, if you want to talk about a chameleon on plaid, this guy has been, on every side of the equation. So if you bet money on the election, and if I'm wrong and you lose, don't come back to me.
Professor, given the difficulty of the job that these men have,
Yes.
has there been any characteristics through time that have been identified as to why these men want that job to go through it?
It's a wonderful question. And I would say, in general, they're what psychologists would describe as narcissistic personalities. They want to be stage center. They want to be the best. Certainly, see, what's so interesting to me is, having studied Johnson and Kennedy very closely, both of them were very narcissistic characters. What's fascinating about them is how they could turn these problems that they had, and they were problems, into constructive effort, see. But they're driven men. They need stage center. They need to be the best, to be the greatest, see. Johnson talked about he wanted to be the greatest president in history. He wanted to eclipse Franklin Roosevelt, see. Kennedy, he couldn't stand to be criticized, see. He was an extraordinary womanizer. It was breathtaking. And in fact, did you see this book that came out in the last year or so by Mimi Alford? Who, I was the one who found out about this 19, 20-year-old intern that he had an affair with. And just briefly, I was reading an oral history in the Kennedy Library by a woman named Barbara Gamarikian, who was a deputy press secretary, and she had 17 blacked out pages. And I happened to meet her at a party in Washington. I said to Barbara, it's 40 years later, 17. She said, all right, I'll open it to you. And there were 17 pages about how Kennedy started having an affair with a 19-year-old beautiful young woman who came down as an intern from a college in Massachusetts, and that this went on for a year and a half. He used to take her on trips with him. And I wrote 38 words in my book about it, very briefly, because what interested me was, in talking to a number of journalists about Kennedy, they said they knew about his womanizing, but in the 1960s, this was not something you wrote about in the leading newspapers, see. Well, she produced this book, and it's really a very candid description of Kennedy and how he couldn't stand to be alone. And Johnson was the same. They can't stand to be alone. They need constant attention, constant salving of their ego. So I think there is this component. Reagan was a movie actor. He needed stage center. Now, of course, there are others. How do you account for someone like a Calvin Coolidge, who was anything but a dynamic personality? Endless jokes about him. He died and reporters said, how could they tell? But he, of course, got there because of the death of Harding, see, and then he decided to run. And so there was William Howard Taft didn't want to be president. He was kind of talked into doing it, see. But I think, by and large, there's something that drives these guys to need this kind of affirmation and this attention. And what you hope for is that they turn it in constructive directions instead of allowing it to sort of become a destructive impulse. But, Johnson, after he left the White House, had a miserable depression, went back to the ranch. He couldn't stand being out of power, out of control. Nixon was the same. Nixon had to write books, and he was struggling for vindication. I tried to get into Nixon's medical and psychological records, and they're locked up in the Nixon library for 75 years. It'll be a treasure trove, I think, when we can get to read these.
Let's take one more question and then go to the garden where we'll have a celebratory drink and where you can ask him more questions and meet with the composer.
Speaking of Kennedy and Johnson,
Yes.
When Johnson was thrust into the presidency, he also wanted to continue the legacy of Kennedy and his legislation. With his expertise with Congress,
Yeah.
as opposed to Kennedy's briefer experience, would Kennedy have been as successful
It's a wonderful
in
question.
civil rights
Yeah.
as
I mean,
Johnson?
the questions that will always remain in relation to Kennedy, number one, would he have been as successful? He had 4 major legislative initiatives on the table when he died: the big tax cut, civil rights, Medicare, and federal aid to education. Johnson got all of those through. Part of it had to do with the fact that Johnson took advantage of Kennedy's martyrdom to sell this to the Congress. The other part of it was that he won a huge landslide in 1964 over Barry Goldwater and carried 2/3 liberal Democratic majorities into both houses with him and gave him the chance to push through the Great Society. Now, it's not to take anything away from him. He was a master legislator. He understood how to deal with those congressmen. Indeed, he had a guy named Bobby Baker who eventually went to prison, but Baker was his sort of intelligence guy. And Johnson wanted to know what a congressman liked to drink, where his wife wanted to go on a trip. Was he happy with his parking space, with the office he had? There was no detail that was too small for Johnson to gather this information. And then when he'd deal with one of these guys, he would, play upon that. He was a master psychologist in that sense. So, but I think Kennedy would have gotten those 4 bills through, I think, in a second term. But I don't think there would have been as much legislation as Johnson got passed, because Johnson was really avid to do these Great Society programs. Indeed, he was much more a domestic president than he was a foreign policy leader, and Kennedy was the reverse. On Vietnam, I don't think Kennedy ever would have escalated that war the way Johnson did. Dean, I have a book that will come out next year in the fall in time for the anniversary of Kennedy's passing, which we call Camelot's Court, inside the Kennedy White House, about Kennedy and his advisors, see? And a lot of it is about most of it's about his foreign policy making and the struggles he had with the military and with his advisors. I don't think he ever would have escalated that war in Vietnam the way Johnson did. So it's, but we'll never know. These are just speculative things. So anyway, well, thank you.